I only wanted to leave behind a piece of myself, but that single stroke of paint would change everything. When I first walked into the building that was now my workplace, it wasn't the glass windows or the gleaming marble floors that struck me. It wasn't the polished steel elevators or the designer suits brushing past me without so much as a glance. No, what hit me hardest was the silence. This wasn't the kind of silence that made you feel calm. It was the kind that pressed down on you, that demanded order, that reminded you you were just another replaceable cog in a corporate machine. The walls, painted in a lifeless shade of gray, only added to it. They stretched down the hallways like empty canvases that no one dared to touch. They weren't there to inspire anyone, they were there to keep people in line. And me? I was just another invisible worker in that system, the kind of employee whose name people forgot the second they heard it. If they bothered to say it at all, they mispronounced it, muttering it in passing without looking up from their phones. I filed papers, typed reports, answered calls. None of it important. None of it noticed. I wasn't the star of this company. I wasn't even on the stage. I was somewhere behind the curtain, forgotten. But even if the world ignored me, there was one thing it couldn't erase: the need to create. For as long as I could remember, art had been the one thing that kept me breathing. As a kid, I drew on old scraps of cardboard when my family couldn't afford sketchbooks. I painted with cheap brushes, crayons, even my fingers if I had to. It didn't matter what I used. It wasn't about the tools. It was about survival. Art was where I put the feelings I couldn't explain out loud. Every fear, every hope, every quiet dream spilled onto paper in the form of shapes and colors. But here, in this building of rules and silence, I had nothing. No sketchbook, no canvas, just endless gray walls. I can't explain why I kept staring at them. Maybe it was because they were too blank, too clean, too untouched. The more I walked past them, the more I felt them mocking me. They looked like they were waiting for something, no, daring someone to leave a mark. Every time I passed them, my fingers itched. My mind sketched invisible flowers, swirls, bursts of color across the gray. But it was forbidden. These walls weren't mine. They weren't anyone's. They were the company's, a symbol of order and structure. To paint on them would be an act of rebellion, the kind of rebellion that could cost me the one fragile stability I had. And yet, temptation grows when you feed it with silence. The more I told myself no, the more my heart whispered yes. Each night when the office emptied, when the hum of conversation faded and the clatter of keyboards went silent, I would linger. My footsteps echoed too loudly down the corridors, and I would glance at the walls, imagining how they would look if I broke the rules. Sometimes I'd reach out, brushing my fingertips against the smooth surface, imagining the bristles of a brush gliding across it. My heart would race, my breath catching as if even the thought was a crime. I told myself it was impossible. Foolish. But still, the seed grew. One evening, when the city outside roared with traffic but the office was silent, I carried something with me, a small, hidden box of paints I had saved up for weeks. They weren't fancy, just cheap acrylics from a store downtown, but to me, they were treasure. I stood before the wall in a deserted hallway, my chest pounding. Above me, security cameras blinked like watchful eyes, but I had chosen a spot carefully, one corner I knew wasn't in their view. The silence around me was heavy, waiting. I pulled out a brush, dipped it into the deepest red, and raised it to the blank gray surface. My hand trembled so badly I almost dropped it. And then, I touched the wall. The bristles left, a streak of red across the gray, and I swear I felt something shift, as if the wall itself had taken a breath. As if the building, so lifeless and sterile, had suddenly remembered what it meant to be alive. I stumbled back, staring at the mark. It was bold, raw, defiant. My throat was dry, my heart hammering in my ears. Fear crashed over me. What if someone saw? What if they traced it back to me? My career, fragile as it was, would be over. For a second, I almost wiped it away, almost convinced myself to run. But then something else rose in me, exhilaration. The red line became a curve. The curve became a shape. The shape became a flower, petals unfurling in the middle of the sterile gray, and once I started, I couldn't stop. My brush moved faster, the colors spilling out of me like they had been waiting for this moment all along. Blue bled into yellow, yellow into green. Flowers burst open, stars spun into existence, vines curled into the corners. The wall came alive under my hands, and for the first time since I had entered this office, so did I. Time disappeared. The building, the rules, the risks, all of it faded. It was just me, the paint, and the silence breaking under the rhythm of creation. My clothes were stained, my fingers smeared with color, my hair falling loose around my face, but I didn't care. For once, I was free. When I finally stepped back, my chest heaving, I saw what I had done. The gray wall was gone. In its place stood something alive, something wild, something that screamed that I existed. Hidden in the middle of it all, in the shape of a bird stretching its wings, I left my mark, my signature. My proof that even if they never remembered my name, I had been here. Tears stung my eyes as I pressed my fingers lightly against the paint. My rebellion, my confession, my piece of life carved into their lifeless empire. I should have left then. I should have cleaned up, hidden my paints, pretended nothing had happened. But I couldn't move. I just stood there, staring at it, my chest swelling with pride and fear. And then, the silence broke. Somewhere down the hallway, faint but steady, came the sound of footsteps. Not casual, not careless, powerful, deliberate. My heart stopped. My brush slipped from my hand. Because I knew that sound. Everyone in the building did. It was the sound of the CEO. I didn't know then that this single painting would draw the attention of the one person I feared most, the CEO. Every brushstroke felt like a heartbeat breaking free. By day, I was invisible. I shuffled through files, answered phones, typed until my wrists ached and no one cared. My voice was so soft, people sometimes spoke over me as if I wasn't even there. I walked past my coworkers, but their eyes slid over me like I was nothing more than part of the furniture. That was my life. But by night, I was someone else. After the first night I dared to paint on that wall, I told myself it was a mistake, a moment of weakness, something I'd never repeat. Yet when I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling of my small apartment, I couldn't stop replaying it. The way the red curved into a flower, the way the gray surrendered under color, the way I felt alive for the first time in years. It haunted me. It tempted me. And so the next night, when the office emptied and the echoes of footsteps disappeared into elevators, I stayed behind again, my little box of paints tucked under my arm like a secret. My heart pounded the same way it had the first night, but this time there was something new behind the fear hunger. The hallways were still lifeless, the walls still gray, but now I knew they didn't have to stay that way. I slipped into the same hidden corridor, the one beyond the reach of the cameras, and opened my box. The smell of acrylic filled the air. My fingers trembled as I dipped the brush into blue this time, and when I pressed it against the wall, I swear I felt the silence break. The stroke curved into another, and another. Soon, blue waves cut through the flowers I had painted the night before, twisting into rivers that stretched across the expanse. Yellow stars scattered above them, green vines curled up from the floor. Each color grew louder, bolder, until the wall no longer belonged to the building, it belonged to me. And with every brushstroke, I felt it. My heart, my soul, my anger at being invisible, my exhaustion, my longing to be seen, all of it bled into the wall. Every curve was a confession. Every color was a scream I had been too afraid to let out. By day, I swallowed my words. By night, I painted them in colors so loud even silence couldn't ignore them. The office had always felt like a machine, rigid, cold, suffocating. But now, in the dead of night, I was breaking it open. With every shade I added, it felt less like rebellion and more like breathing, like I was saving myself from drowning in gray. Still, guilt followed me. Every time the brush scraped against the wall, I froze, listening. Every shift in the air made me panic. I painted with one ear always alert, waiting for footsteps that could end it all. And yet, I couldn't stop. Fear kept me alive, but art kept me sane. The nights blurred together. What began as one flower became forests, rivers, stars, storms, suns. The wall transformed into something alive, something wild. It was chaos, but it was my chaos. And in that chaos, I found freedom. There were nights when my tears mixed with the paint, nights when my hand cramped so badly I had to press it against the wall just to keep moving. Nights when my vision blurred from exhaustion, but my brush still found the wall, because stopping felt worse than the risk. Sometimes, I would laugh quietly to myself. Here I was, a nobody in the daytime, but an outlaw artist by night. No one clapped for me. No one praised me. No one even knew. And yet I felt more alive in those hours of secrecy than I ever had in the daylight. But the danger never left. The smell of paint hung in the air. My shoes squeaked against the polished floor. My brush scraped too loudly against the plaster. It felt like the building itself was holding its breath, waiting to betray me. One creak, one echo, one wrong step, and everything would collapse. I told myself to stop. I told myself it was enough. But every time I tried to walk away, the wall called me back. Empty spaces begged to be filled, and my hands refused to stay still. Until one night, I was painting a bird wings spread wide, soaring across a patch of stars when I felt it. The air shifted. At first, I thought it was just the usual paranoia. I told myself it was the hum of the air conditioner, the faint groan of the building settling into the night. But then I froze. The silence had changed. It wasn't empty anymore. Somewhere down the corridor, a sound broke through, faint, steady, rhythmic. Footsteps. Not casual, not hesitant, deliberate, powerful. My chest locked. My hand trembled so violently the brush slipped, leaving a jagged streak across the wing. My throat went dry. My knees weakened. I knew those footsteps. Everyone in the office did. And when the echo grew closer, louder, inescapable, I realized the truth. I wasn't alone anymore. And then I heard the echo of footsteps behind me, steady, powerful, impossible to mistake. The air shifted, he had arrived, and I was caught. At first, I told myself I was imagining it. My heart was pounding too hard, my breath too shallow. Maybe the footsteps were just echoes from the street outside. But then, they grew louder, closer, each one steady, deliberate, impossible to mistake. I froze in front of the wall, brush still dripping blue, my body locked in place. The mural behind me glowed with color under the dim lights. But suddenly it felt less like art and more like a confession written too loud to hide. My secret was no longer safe. The footsteps stopped at the corner. For one long, unbearable moment, silence stretched. And then, he appeared. The CEO. I had seen him before, of course, but only from a distance, sweeping through the office with a trail of assistants scrambling behind him, board members straightening their ties in his presence, managers lowering their voices when he passed. He didn't just walk into a room, he owned it. And now he stood only a few feet away from me, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark, tailored suit that probably cost more than my yearly salary. His posture was straight, his movements precise, his polished shoes gleaming under the lights. His face was carved in sharp lines, every feature controlled, but it was his eyes that froze me. Cold, piercing, the kind of eyes that didn't just look at you, but through you, as if stripping away every defense you thought you had. The corridor seemed smaller with him in it. The air heavier. My knees threatened to give way, and I gripped the brush so tightly my knuckles turned white. He said nothing at first. He only looked at me, at the wall, at the paint staining my clothes, at the defiance spread across his empire in colors he had never authorized. His silence was worse than any words. I wanted to speak, to beg, to explain, but my throat closed. My lips parted, but no sound came. I had no excuses, no defense. I was caught. My mind raced with what could happen next. He could fire me on the spot, call security, demand repayment for damaging company property, or worse, erase me so thoroughly that I'd vanish. Just another warning whispered in the hallways. She broke the rules. Look what happened to her. I had heard the stories. People who failed him didn't just lose their jobs. They lost their careers, their reputations, their futures. One mistake in his presence could end everything. And what I had done? This wasn't a mistake. This was rebellion. Finally, he moved. His shoes clicked against the marble floor, each step sharp and controlled, echoing like a countdown to my end. He stopped only a few feet from the wall, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression unreadable. He studied the mural, every color, every flower, every river, every star. My rebellion, my confession, laid bare before him. His eyes narrowed slightly, not enough to betray anger, but enough to make my stomach twist. I held my breath, waiting. Seconds felt like hours. The silence burned in my ears, louder than any storm. My chest ached with the effort of holding in my panic, my legs trembling so badly I feared I'd collapse. Finally, his gaze shifted from the wall to me. I flinched under it, dropping my eyes to the floor. My throat was dry, my breath shallow, my palms slick with sweat. I wanted to disappear, to sink into the marble beneath my feet, to erase every stroke of color behind me. But there was no escape. He stepped closer. His presence loomed, towering over me, so heavy I felt like the air itself bent around him. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, precise, cutting through the silence like a blade. "What?" he said slowly. "Do you think you're doing?" The words weren't shouted. He didn't need to raise his voice. The weight of his tone was enough to crush me. My mouth opened, but nothing came out. My body shook with the effort to find words, to explain, to beg for mercy, but every possible answer felt like a trap. I was just... My voice cracked, useless. My hand trembled, still clutching the brush as though it could save me, though it was the very evidence of my crime. He didn't let me finish. His eyes returned to the mural, scanning the defiant waves of color once more. His jaw tightened, his lips pressed into a firm line, but he said nothing. The silence stretched again, and then something shifted. His eyes narrowed not with rage, not with disgust, but with something else entirely. A flicker of something sharp, dangerous, but not hatred. Curiosity. The realization made my stomach drop. I had expected fury, humiliation, punishment. But curiosity? That was something far more unpredictable. He took a step back, his gaze lingering on the wall as though trying to solve a puzzle. The silence didn't lift. If anything, it grew heavier, because now I didn't know what he was thinking, what he was planning, or what would come next. I was trapped in that moment, suspended between ruin and something I couldn't yet name. And when his eyes returned to mine, steady and unreadable, I felt my heart stop. But instead of anger, his eyes narrowed, with something else entirely curiosity. To him, my art was either brilliance or destruction. The silence pressed down on me so heavily I thought I might collapse under it. His eyes, sharp as glass, flicked between me and the mural, dissecting every brushstroke, every trembling movement of my hands. My stomach twisted until it hurt, my chest rising and falling with shallow, panicked breaths. Finally, he spoke. "Why would you do this?" His voice wasn't raised, but it didn't have to be. The low, measured tone carried more power than shouting ever could. It was sharp, controlled, precise, the kind of voice that left no space for lies or excuses. My lips parted, but my throat was dry. My mind scrambled for words, any words, but none of them felt safe. I only what?" He cut in, his gaze slicing through me like a blade. Behind me, a sound broke through the suffocating silence, whispers. I hadn't realized others had gathered. My co-workers. Shadows at the edge of the corridor, peeking in, drawn by the scene unfolding before them. Their hushed voices pricked at my skin like needles. "She's finished." He'll fire her on the spot. I told you she wouldn't last. My body trembled harder. Their words fed the terror already clawing inside me. I was no longer just caught. I was on display. A spectacle for them to whisper about. Later, the CEO took a step closer. His polished shoes struck the marble with deliberate precision, each sound echoing like judgment itself. When he stopped just a breath away, his presence suffocated me, filling the narrow corridor until there was nowhere left for me to stand. This office, he said slowly, his voice cold and unyielding, is built on structure, order, precision, and you, his eyes narrowed, his words like venom, decided to deface it with this. He gestured toward the mural with the slightest tilt of his head, but his eyes never left mine. Tears stung my vision. My chest ached with the pressure of holding myself upright. I didn't mean to ruin anything, I whispered, my voice so small it was nearly swallowed by the silence. He tilted his head, studying me with the intensity of someone trying to solve a riddle. His gaze flicked back to the wall, then returned to me, sharper than before. Did you think this was art? His tone dripped with disdain. Because all I see is recklessness, chaos where there should be discipline, disorder where there should be perfection. Each word felt like a hammer against my chest. My fingers clenched around the brush, still stained with blue, though it felt ridiculous to hold on to it now, like clutching a weapon made of paper in front of an executioner. Behind me, the whispers grew louder. She's crying. He's destroying her. She won't survive this. I wanted to scream at them, to stop, to disappear, to leave me alone, but my body was frozen, trapped under the weight of his presence, his words, his power. Finally, I managed to force sound past the tightness in my throat. Please, I whispered, desperate, trembling. I didn't mean disrespect. I only wanted to bring life to the emptiness. His eyes flickered dangerously. For a moment, his expression hardened into something almost furious. Life, he repeated, his voice dropping lower, darker. You think this office exists for your life? For your chaos? This isn't your canvas. This is my empire. The words crushed me. I felt my knees weaken, my breath breaking in shallow gasps. My tears spilled despite my effort to hold them back, burning as they trailed down my cheeks. The silence stretched again. His eyes stayed locked on me, dissecting, weighing, deciding. The whispers behind me quieted, holding their breath for the inevitable blow. I braced myself. I knew what was coming: dismissal, humiliation, destruction. And then, he spoke again, his lips parted, his voice cutting through the air like lightning. Do it again. For a second, I didn't understand. My breath caught in my throat. The words didn't register. Behind me, gasps erupted. Shock rippled through the small crowd. What did he say? Did he just? No, that can't be right. But when I looked back at him, his eyes were steady, his expression unreadable. His command had been deliberate. Do it again, he repeated, sharper this time. Expand it. Prove it wasn't an accident. My entire body froze. The brush slipped in my trembling grip. This wasn't forgiveness. This wasn't mercy. This was something far more terrifying. It was a test. And then, to everyone's shock, he said, do it again. The words felt unreal. He wanted me to paint more. For a moment, I thought I had misheard him. My ears buzzed with the weight of whispers, my heart pounding so loudly it drowned out everything else. But his words clung to the air, sharp and deliberate. Do it again. It didn't make sense. This was the man known for tearing people apart over a typo in a report, for dismissing entire departments if their performance slipped for a quarter. He destroyed mistakes. He didn't encourage them. And yet here he stood, looking at me not with rage, but with something far more dangerous: expectation. The crowd of employees behind me shifted, uneasily. Their gasps turned into frantic whispers. He told her to keep going? Why isn't he firing her? This doesn't happen. It can't be real. But his eyes never wavered. They were locked on me, steady, piercing, leaving no room for escape. I bent slowly, my trembling hand reaching for the brush I had dropped, my fingers wrapped around it like it was both a weapon and a chain. My breath shook as I straightened again, my knees weak beneath me. I wanted to refuse. I wanted to scream that I couldn't, that I wasn't an artist, that this was madness. But when I opened my mouth, nothing came. His presence swallowed every word. "Paint," he said again, his voice low and precise, as though the single word carried all the weight of his empire. My body obeyed before my mind could protest. I dipped the brush into the paint, my hand trembling so violently I almost dropped it again. I turned to the wall, the mural that had once been my rebellion, and suddenly it looked like a prison. The first stroke was hesitant, shaky. It didn't feel the same. Before, the wall had been mine. Now it was his. Every movement was a test, every color a risk, every curve a gamble. The silence was unbearable. Behind me, the whispers of my coworkers crawled across my skin like ants. In front of me, the CEO's gaze burned into my back, so heavy I could barely breathe. I dragged the brush across the wall, adding to the mural with hands that shook from fear more than passion. My strokes felt clumsy, wrong, suffocated. The freedom I had once tasted was gone, and yet, the longer I painted, the more something shifted inside me. My fear didn't fade, but underneath it, the rhythm of creation stirred again. The wall responded the way it always had, pulling me deeper, demanding more. My hand steadied, the colors blended, shapes bloomed. But it wasn't rebellion this time. It was survival. Each line I drew wasn't just art, it was a plea to prove I wasn't a mistake, a plea to convince him I had worth. Minutes stretched like hours. Sweat dripped down my back, my arm ached from holding the brush too tightly, my chest rose and fell with desperate breaths, and still, I painted. Finally, I lowered my brush. My body trembled with exhaustion. I dared to glance at him. He stood in silence, his eyes scanning the new strokes, his face unreadable. His hands were clasped behind his back, his posture perfect, his presence filling the hallway like a shadow. The whispers behind me grew frantic again. What does he think? She's finished. Or maybe not. The weight was unbearable. My pulse hammered, my stomach twisted, my knees threatened to give out. Then he exhaled, slow and controlled. "Better," he said at last. One word, just one. But it was enough to knock the air from my lungs. Better. Not good. Not brilliant. Not even acceptable. Just better. And yet, that single word was more than I had expected. It wasn't dismissal. It wasn't rejection. It wasn't the end. The CEO's eyes locked on mine again, steady, unrelenting. His expression was still unreadable, but there was something in his gaze I hadn't seen before. Interest. "Continue," he said firmly, "until I say otherwise." The finality in his tone sent a chill through me. This wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't even a challenge. It was a command, one that bound me to the wall, to the paint, to him. I clutched the brush tighter, my chest heaving, my mind spinning. I had thought this was the end of me, but instead, it was only the beginning. But I had no idea that his command was not just a test. It was an invitation into his world. Color began to breathe life, where there had only been silence. The days that followed were nothing like before. The gray walls that had once been a background no one noticed were now the center of everything. And I was no longer painting in secret. The CEO's command had turned my rebellion into a duty. Each morning, I walked into the office with my little box of paints, my hands trembling, my chest heavy with dread. My coworkers stared as I passed, their eyes wide, their whispers buzzing like static around me. "She's still here? Why hasn't he fired her? He told her to keep painting? That can't be true." But it was true, because every day, under the sharp weight of his gaze, I picked up my brush and touched the walls again. At first, my hands shook so badly I thought I might ruin everything. The freedom I'd felt when I painted alone in the dead of night was gone. Now, every stroke was watched. Every color was measured. Every mistake could cost me more than my job. And yet, something strange happened. The more I painted, the more the office began to change. The once sterile corridors started to breathe. The dull, lifeless walls softened under the spread of colors. Vines curled upward like they were reaching for the ceiling, blossoms unfurled across corners, rivers cut through expanses of gray. The building that had once felt like a tomb began to feel alive, each hallway humming with quiet energy, and people noticed. At first, they only lingered out of curiosity, their skepticism dripping from every glance. They expected me to fail, to embarrass myself, to be crushed under the weight of the CEO's impossible expectations. But as the walls transformed, their whispers shifted. "This is incredible. It doesn't feel like the same place. I never thought I'd say this, but I like it." Some stood in silence, their eyes wide as though seeing the office for the first time. Others leaned closer, pointing at the details, a bird hidden in the vines, a star tucked into a painted sky. Their disbelief softened into something else, admiration. For the first time in my life, people were looking at me, really looking at me. But not everyone admired. Some whispered with envy, their voices sharp, their glances colder than the gray I was covering. "She's just lucky. Anyone could do this. She's only here because he lets her." Their words stung, but I forced myself to keep painting, because I had no choice. Every stroke of the brush was survival now. And always, always, I felt him. The CEO never praised. He never criticized, not in front of others. But he was there. Sometimes, standing at the end of the hall, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Other times, lingering in the shadows, watching with eyes that caught every detail. His silence weighed heavier than all the whispers combined. I tried to ignore it, to focus on the wall, but I could feel him, always. His gaze pressed against my skin, seeped into my breath, followed the movement of my hand. It was as though he wasn't just watching the art, he was watching me, and that terrified me more than anger ever could. Still, the mural grew. What began as rebellion spread into something larger, something undeniable. The office, once gray, once lifeless, was transforming, and so was I. I wasn't invisible anymore. Each day, as the colors spread across the walls, I felt something inside me shift. Pride, fear, hope, all tangled together. I was no longer just a quiet worker shuffling papers. I was the girl with the paint. The girl changing the very face of the empire. And yet, with every new stroke, the questions grew louder in my head. Why was he letting me do this? Why hadn't he stopped me? What did he see in me in this? I didn't know the answer. But the more I painted, the more I felt it, his gaze. Heavy, searching, as though he wasn't just seeing the colors, but something deeper, something I didn't even know I was showing, and that unsettled me more than anything else. Because it meant I wasn't just painting walls anymore. I was painting myself. Yet the more I painted, the more I felt his gaze heavy, searching, as though he saw more than just the art. My art was no longer a secret, it was a storm. I had never wanted attention. All I ever wanted was to exist without being erased, to leave behind a mark even if no one noticed. But now, there was no hiding. The mural had outgrown me. What began as rebellion had spread into the bloodstream of the office, and everyone felt it. The colors crawled across the walls like wildfire, and the whispers followed wherever I went. "She's the one who painted it. How did she even think of this? It doesn't even look like the same office anymore." The voices carried down hallways, through break rooms, into elevators. For the first time in my life, people spoke about me, not as the quiet, invisible girl no one remembered, but as someone impossible to ignore. At first, I didn't know how to feel. The stares made my skin burn. The hushed conversations made my stomach twist. But buried beneath the discomfort was something I couldn't deny. For once, I mattered. And that was terrifying, because admiration has a shadow. And that shadow was jealousy. Not everyone looked at my work with awe. Some looked at it with narrowed eyes, with lips curled into disdain, with whispers sharper than knives. She's only doing this for attention. It's just paint on a wall. Anyone could do it. She's nothing special. He probably just favors her. Their voices followed me like smoke. I tried to drown them out, to focus on the paint, but they seeped into my chest, stinging worse than the exhaustion in my hands. The office split itself into two worlds, those who admired what I was creating and those who despised me for it. Supporters stood quietly, their eyes soft with wonder. Skeptics whispered daggers behind my back. And I stood in the storm, painted into both roles at once, admired and hated, celebrated and resented. But through it all, he was there. The CEO never defended me publicly. He didn't silence the skeptics, didn't praise me aloud. But his silence was its own kind of shield. Because when the whispers grew too loud, when suggestions of removing the mural surfaced, he appeared. His sharp eyes sliced through the room, and the words died on their tongues. His presence alone was enough to erase their protests before they could take root. They didn't understand. None of them did. Because while they whispered in shadows, he was always watching in silence. And it wasn't the mural he was studying. It was me. I felt it every time I picked up the brush. His gaze, heavy, unrelenting, dissecting every movement of my hand. His silence was louder than applause, more dangerous than criticism. Sometimes I thought his interest meant approval. Other times, I thought it meant suspicion. And the not knowing the impossibility of reading him was worse than either. The weight of it grew unbearable. The more they whispered, the more I painted. The more I painted, the heavier his gaze pressed against me. It was as if the walls weren't mine anymore, as if my art wasn't mine. And still, I couldn't stop. Because stopping meant failing. Failing him, failing myself, failing the piece of me I had carved into these walls. Each night, I returned to the wall, even when my arms ached, even when my eyes burned, even when exhaustion threatened to swallow me whole. I painted because it was the only way to survive the storm. But the whispers didn't fade. They grew louder, stronger, until one morning, the air shifted in a way that made my skin prickle. A message spread like wildfire. The CEO wants to see you. My heart stopped. The whispers erupted again, louder than ever, frantic and poisonous. She's done for. He's finally going to end it. No one comes back the same after he summons them. I froze where I stood, the brush trembling in my hand. My chest tightened, my stomach knotted, my legs felt like stone. Because this time, the whispers might have been right. And then came the day he summoned me alone to his office. What he asked of me was beyond anything I had imagined. The summons came like a thunderclap. No warning, no explanation. Just a message carried down the hallway in a voice trembling with both awe and dread. The CEO wants to see you. My heart stopped. The whispers ignited instantly, a wildfire racing through the office. She's finished. He's finally going to end this madness. No one comes back the same after being called in. Their words wrapped around me, tightening until I could hardly breathe. My hands trembled as I set the brush down, my palms slick with sweat. Every step I took toward his office felt heavier than the last, my shoes echoing against the polished floor like the toll of a bell. The CEO's office loomed ahead, its dark wooden doors towering like a gate to another world. I raised my hand, but before my knuckles touched the surface, his voice cut through from inside. Enter. The single word sliced through the silence, commanding and cold. My stomach knotted, and with shaking fingers, I pushed the door open. The room was vast. Cold light streamed through tall glass windows, illuminating every sharp line of the perfectly arranged shelves, the gleaming desk, the clock ticking with merciless precision. It was a space built for power, not comfort. A space that reflected him. And there he was. He sat behind his desk, straight-backed, his eyes lifted from a document to pin me in place. That gaze froze me where I stood, stripped me bare, dissected me without a word. I swallowed hard, gripping my hands together to keep them from trembling. For a long, unbearable moment, he said nothing. Just studied me. Me, the girl who had painted her rebellion across his empire. Finally, he spoke. "You painted what no one else dared." The words startled me more than fury ever could. My lips parted, but no sound escaped. He rose from his chair then, tall and commanding, each step toward me deliberate, echoing across the marble floor until he stood only a breath away. His presence filled the space, suffocating yet magnetic, impossible to escape. "This office," he said slowly, his voice low but sharp, "is efficient, structured, immaculate, but it is dead." His eyes burned into mine, unrelenting. "Every day, I walk through these halls and feel nothing, no spark, no life, just gray repetition." He paused, his gaze flickering toward the mural etched into my memory. "And then, you defied me." And for the first time in years, these walls felt alive. The confession struck me like lightning. My chest tightened, my knees weakened, and for a moment, I wondered if I had misheard. This was him, the man who demanded order, who punished mistakes, who built an empire out of silence. To hear him admit to emptiness was unthinkable. My voice trembled when I finally dared to speak. I only wanted to bring color. I didn't mean to." He silenced me with a sharp gesture of his hand. "You did not mean to," he said. "And yet you did, and now I want more." My breath caught, my pulse quickened, my mind spinning. "More?" He stepped back, his eyes never leaving mine. "I am giving you a task, not as an act of mercy, not as punishment, as a command." His tone hardened with each word. "Design this office." The words slammed into me. My knees nearly buckled. My throat closed. "Design the office?" I repeated, barely above a whisper. "Yes." His voice was final, unyielding. "Every wall, every corridor, every space in this building, transform it. Make it breathe, as you made that wall breathe. Give it life." I staggered back a step, the weight of his command crashing over me. I was no architect, no professional designer. I was a girl with paint-stained fingers and a fire she barely understood. How could he ask this of me? I don't know how," I stammered, my voice cracking under the weight of the impossible. I'm not." His eyes narrowed, cutting through my panic like a blade. "You think I chose you because of credentials? Because of rules? If rules could create life, this office would not feel like a graveyard. I chose you because you see what they cannot. You dared to break the silence." His words sank deep, terrifying, and intoxicating all at once. For the first time, someone had called my defiance strength instead of weakness, but the fear was still there, heavy and suffocating. I raised my eyes to him, my voice trembling. "And if I fail?" For the first time, his expression shifted. Something dangerous flickered in his gaze. Not anger, not disappointment, but cold finality. His lips curved, not into a smile, but into a warning. "If you fail," he said softly, "you're gone forever." The words struck harder than any punishment. My chest tightened, my blood ran cold, my body trembling from head to toe. This wasn't just a task, it was survival. But his final words shook me even more. "If you fail, you're gone forever." Suddenly, my art was not freedom, it was survival. The moment I left his office, the air itself felt heavier. The same corridors I had painted with rebellion now loomed around me like a cage, closing in tighter with every step I took. The walls no longer felt like mine. They were his. His command echoed in my head with every breath I drew. "Design this office. If you fail, you're gone forever." It was no longer rebellion, no longer expression. It was a trial. That night, I sat hunched over a small desk in my cramped apartment, a single lamp casting weak light onto the blank sheets of paper in front of me. My paints sat untouched in their box. The brush that had once been my weapon now felt like dead weight. Instead, I gripped a pencil, my hand trembling as I tried to sketch. Lines appeared, faint and hesitant, only to be erased moments later. Again and again, I tried, and again I failed. The page filled with scars of erasure, smudges of graphite, marks of desperation. My wastebasket overflowed with crumpled paper, each ball a tiny confession of defeat. My chest ached with the weight of it. I wasn't a designer. I wasn't an architect. I was just a girl who had painted a wall because she was suffocating. And now, I was supposed to turn gray empires into life? The fear consumed me. What if the mural had been a fluke? What if it wasn't talent, just desperation spilling out of me in one lucky night? What if he realized he had been wrong to see something in me? Worse, what if he was right, and I proved myself a failure in front of him? His face haunted me, that sharp, unrelenting gaze, that final warning, if you fail, you're gone forever. The words chased me through every sketch, every shaky line, every sleepless night. I barely ate. I barely slept. My days blurred into nights, my nights into dawns, the lamp burning until its light flickered weakly, fighting to stay alive as I scribbled. Erased. Scribbled again. My fingers blistered from the pencil. My eyes burned from exhaustion. My body shook with fatigue, but I couldn't stop. Because stopping meant surrender, and surrender meant the end. My coworkers noticed the change. They saw the shadows under my eyes, the tremor in my hands when I reached for my brush, the way my shoulders slumped under invisible weight. Their whispers carried pity now, tangled with cruelty. She's breaking. She won't last. He'll replace her in a heartbeat. Their words sank into me like poison, feeding the doubts that already consumed me. I pressed harder against the paper, sketching until the lines blurred from my tears. But no matter how hard I tried, nothing felt good enough. The wall had once been my confessional, my rebellion, my freedom. Now, every sketch was a chain, every attempt strangled by the thought of his judgment. The art wasn't mine anymore. It belonged to him, to his command, to his gaze, to his empire. And still, I kept going. Because beneath the fear, beneath the exhaustion, there was one fragile spark that refused to die. The thought that if I succeeded, if I could truly transform this place, I would no longer be invisible. I would be irreplaceable. That thought kept me alive. Still, the weight grew heavier with every passing day. My sketches piled up, but none felt right. None felt alive. My hands trembled so violently I could barely hold the pencil. My breaths came shallow, my chest tight, my vision blurred with exhaustion. And then, one night, when I was bent over the desk again, ready to collapse, I felt it. The air shifted. A presence filled the room. My body froze, my pencil slipping from my hand. I didn't have to turn around to know. The silence told me. The heaviness told me. The way my heart stopped told me. He was there, the CEO, watching me, again. And just when I thought I couldn't go on, he appeared behind me again, silently watching. He wasn't just testing my art, he was testing me. The nights blurred into one another. Sleep became a stranger. Food lost its taste. All I knew was the paper, the paint, the pencil in my trembling hand. And always, behind it all, his presence. He never announced himself. He didn't need to. The air told me when he arrived, heavy, charged, impossible to ignore. One moment I would be hunched over a sketch, convinced I was alone, and the next, I would feel him, watching, waiting. At first, it was his silence that terrified me. But then came his words. Too crowded. Too predictable. This line lacks courage. His critiques cut like blades, sharp, precise, merciless. And yet, beneath the sting, I began to realize something unsettling. He wasn't dismissing me. He was pushing me. Every time he pointed out a flaw, every time he tore into my work, he wasn't demanding I stop. He was demanding I go further. Beyond what I thought I could do. Beyond what I had ever dared to imagine. It was maddening, terrifying, and yet intoxicating. Because in those moments, when his eyes lingered on my sketches, When his voice pressed against me with sharp authority, I felt something no one had ever given me before. Belief. Not kindness. Not praise. Belief. As though he saw in me something even I couldn't see. The tension between us thickened with every passing day. He was power, immovable, unyielding. I was passion, fragile but burning with a fire that refused to die. When his critiques clashed with my instincts, sparks flew. "This doesn't belong here," he would say, pointing to a swirl of color. "It does," I whispered back, my voice trembling but firm. The defiance startled even me, but instead of crushing me, he paused. His eyes narrowed, considering me, and then almost imperceptibly his lips curved, not in anger, not in disdain, but in something dangerously close to approval. It felt like a battle we were fighting without words. He demanded order. I gave him chaos shaped into beauty. He sought perfection. I gave him emotion. And somewhere between the two, something unspoken began to take root. I caught it in his eyes sometimes, the way they lingered too long, not just on the wall, but on me. The way his voice softened, barely noticeable, when he asked, "Why this color?" As if he truly wanted to understand what guided my hand. The way he stood too close, his presence pressing into my skin like heat, as though the art wasn't the only thing pulling him nearer. It terrified me. It exhilarated me. No one had ever looked at me like that before. To the world, I was invisible, a quiet girl in the shadows of an empire. But to him, in those charged moments, I was something else. Something rare. Something alive. And slowly, I began to see myself the way he saw me. Not just as the girl with paint-stained fingers, but as a creator, a force, someone whose art could command even the coldest gaze in the building. But with that realization came danger. Because this was no longer just about art. This was about him and me, and the dangerous, fragile bond growing between us with every brushstroke, every critique, every silence heavy with words we dared not say aloud. The whispers around the office grew louder, sharper. "Why her? What does he see in her? This isn't just about painting anymore." Their voices poisoned the air, reminding me that whatever this was, it was forbidden, fragile, destined to shatter if exposed. But in those moments, when it was just him and me, the world fell away. The walls weren't just walls anymore. They were a canvas of something greater, something that bound us together in ways neither of us dared to name. He wasn't just testing my art. He was testing me. But the closer he came, the more I wondered, was I building an office or stepping into his heart? The day came when the gray walls had to breathe in front of the world. For weeks, I had painted until my hands blistered, until my body ached, until my eyes burned with sleeplessness. I had poured everything into the walls, every fear, every hope, every hidden scream of my soul. And now the day had come. The reveal. From the moment I woke that morning, the air itself felt different, heavy, sharp, as though even the building knew this was no ordinary day. The corridors that had once been a tomb of sterile perfection now pulsed with color. Vines curled toward ceilings, blossoms burst from corners, rivers cut across stretches of plaster and spilled into skies painted with stars. Birds spread their wings mid-flight, their feathers catching the light from tall glass windows, so real it seemed they could fly free at any moment. The office was no longer dead, it was alive, but as the first footsteps echoed through the hallways, dread knotted in my stomach. The staff arrived first, their whispers fluttering like moths against the walls. Then the clients came, sharp suits and sharper eyes, walking in with polite disinterest that melted into wide-eyed disbelief the moment they saw the murals. Finally, the board members entered, their expressions carved from stone, their authority heavy enough to make entire departments tremble. And then, silence. Every eye turned toward the walls. Their disbelief was palpable. Some gasped openly, their hands flying to their mouths. Others whispered in urgent tones, fragments breaking through the hush. Incredible. Who did this? Unbelievable. My heart thundered so hard I thought they could hear it. My hands trembled, my throat dry, my knees weak beneath me. For the first time, my work was no longer a secret, no longer confined to late nights and whispered defiance. It was exposed, vulnerable, and so was I. I should have felt proud. I should have stood taller. But all I felt was terror, because their approval didn't matter. Not really. The only judgment that mattered stood just beside me, the CEO. He had been there since dawn, silent as ever, watching as I painted the final strokes. His presence had loomed over me, steady, unrelenting, his expression impossible to read. And now, as the room filled with whispers and awe, he remained immovable. His eyes never left me. The silence stretched, suffocating. My breath came in shallow waves, my palms slick with sweat. The staff shifted nervously behind me. The clients murmured in hushed tones. The board members narrowed their eyes, but I couldn't focus on any of them. All I could feel was his gaze. And then, finally, he moved. He stepped forward into the center of the room. The air shifted instantly. Conversations died. Whispers cut short. The silence thickening as though the building itself held its breath. His presence filled the space like gravity, pulling every eye toward him. "This," he said, his voice deep and steady, echoing against the painted walls, "is no longer an office. It is vision. It is life." The words struck the air like a hammer. Gasps rippled through the room. Board members exchanged startled glances. Clients leaned forward with newfound interest, and the staff froze where they stood, their envy and disbelief painted across their faces. But I could barely hear them, because his eyes were still on me. The weight of that gaze rooted me in place, my chest heaving, my knees trembling. I wanted to disappear into the colors I had painted, to vanish into the blossoms and rivers and skies, to escape the unbearable exposure of that moment. But I couldn't move. The silence grew heavier, unbearable. And then, in front of everyone, the staff, the clients, the board, he turned his head slightly, his eyes still locked on mine. And with a voice that carried through the room, he asked me a question that made my blood run cold, a question that would change everything. And then, in front of everyone, he asked me a question that changed my fate. The walls were no longer gray, and neither was my life. For so long, I had lived in the background, a shadow in polished corridors, unseen and unheard, existing only in the quiet spaces between tasks no one else wanted. My hands had scrubbed desks, carried files, answered phones, but never once had they been trusted with anything that mattered. But now, the walls told my story. The once sterile office was alive. Blossoms spilled from corners, vines curled upward into imagined skies, rivers ran across plaster, and stars scattered across ceilings as though the universe itself had seeped inside. The building that had once suffocated me now breathed with color, with life, with my soul carved into every surface. And for the first time, I wasn't invisible. The clients and board members whispered in awe. The staff who had once mocked me now stared with thinly veiled resentment, their envy sharp as glass. But none of it mattered. Not really. Because the only words that carried weight had already been spoken, his words. This is no longer an office. It is life. He hadn't said my name. He hadn't needed to. Every eye in that room had turned to me. And in that moment, I was no longer just a girl with paint-stained fingers. I was someone who had turned gray into gold. But with recognition came something heavier. Expectation. Because this wasn't the end. This was the beginning. That night, when the corridors emptied and silence returned, I walked alone through the transformed halls. My fingers brushed the walls, tracing blossoms and stars, feeling the texture of the paint beneath my touch. My chest swelled with pride, but beneath it throbbed a quieter, darker fear. Was this truly freedom? Or just another cage? Because his gaze still followed me, always. The next morning, I was summoned again. His office was unchanged, tall windows, polished desk, relentless clock. But as I stepped inside, the air felt different, heavy, expectant. He stood by the window, his back to me, his reflection caught in the glass against the city skyline. His posture was as rigid as ever, his hands clasped behind him. When he turned, his eyes locked onto mine with the same sharp intensity that had haunted me for weeks. "You've changed this place," he said simply. His voice carried no warmth, but beneath the steel there was something raw, something fragile, as though the words cost him more than he wanted to admit. I swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. My voice stuck in my throat. "And in doing so," he continued, stepping closer, "you've changed yourself." His gaze didn't waver. "You are no longer invisible. You are no longer replaceable." The words struck deep. They should have filled me with triumph, but instead, they weighed on me like chains made of gold. Because with those words came a truth I hadn't dared to face. I wasn't free. I was bound. Not to the walls. To him. Every brushstroke, every sketch, every moment of defiance had tethered me to the man who now stood before me, sharp, unreadable, dangerous. His acknowledgement wasn't liberation. It was possession. My chest tightened as I realized what it meant. This was not just a new beginning. This was a new canvas. And I was the one being painted. But as I looked at him, I wondered, was this truly my new beginning, or just the start of a more dangerous design? If this story pulled you in and made you feel something, don't let it end here. Share your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done in her place? Hit the like button if you want more stories like this, and subscribe so you never miss the next twist. Your support is what keeps these stories alive.